Hey guys, Joshua Deptip channel, and today what we're going to be discussing is 7 things that could secretly be hurting your diesel engine, and you may not even know it, or maybe you thought it was good for the engine. So these are topics that a few of them we've discussed in the past in full-length videos, but I just wanted to retouch on them or add a little bit more information, and some of these we've never really discussed before, so let's get into it. Okay, so the first thing we're going to discuss is actually that's probably something that's pretty controversial, and that's actually warming up your diesel engine. You might be saying, well, that's right, Josh. I warm up my diesel engine every day. That's great. Actually, it's not, depending on how you warm it up. And the biggest reason is warming it up slowly isn't really good for the engine. So generally when people say they're going to warm up their diesel engine, what they're doing is they go out there 30 minutes before they have to go to work or drive the vehicle, and they start it up and they let it idle for 30 minutes. And they get in it, and the coolant temperature is at 140 degrees, and then they take off. That type of warming up is actually not good for the engine, and it's a bad idea for several reasons. One, you're wasting a lot of fuel, but more importantly, you secretly could be damaging your diesel engine, and the reason for that is that style of warming up is very inefficient. So when you're idling your engine, especially when it's cold, you're not burning all the fuel that's in there because diesel engines, being a compression ignition engine, rely on the heat and heated up air in the cylinders to fire. Now, diesel engines generally, they have very large cooling packages, and they're very efficient while idling as far as how much fuel is burned, so they don't generate tons and tons of heat. What is damaging there is, since that fuel is not fully being burned, you're getting potentially wet stacking, you're getting a lot of unburned fuel and nasty byproducts of the combustion process into your oil. The cylinder walls aren't properly heating up because, one thing, there's not a lot of pressure at idle in the cylinders, so it's bad for the piston rings. You can get carbon around the piston rings building up, and the cylinder walls themselves aren't at the right temperature, so you can actually be damaging the crosshatch and the condition of the liners. So the best thing to do if you are going to warm it up, and of course if it's 10 degrees Fahrenheit outside, you don't want to just start it and go full throttle right away. Let's say it is 10 degrees outside, you start your diesel engine. Best thing would be, of course, have a block heater or oil heater already on the engine, so it's somewhat warmed up already. But you would start it, let's say give it 30 seconds to a minute to fully get oil throughout the engine. Raise the RPM, 1,000 to 1,200 RPM. You're basically doubling your idle speed, but more importantly, you're going to get those cylinder walls hotter, you're going to get better combustion, more cylinder pressures, and you will be doing less damage to your diesel engine. Now, the number 2 item we're going to talk about ties in a lot with the don't warming up your diesel engine idea, and that is idling too much. Now, of course, idling doesn't necessarily have to happen when you're just starting your diesel engine. A lot of people just idle their trucks for long periods of time. Now, some truck drivers, they need to stay in the vehicle. Maybe it's Phoenix and it's July and it's 120 degrees outside, and they need their 10 hours down, and they're not going to stay in a hotel. They're going to run their air conditioner, right? You'd be crazy not to. Best thing to do generally is don't idle it at just base engine RPM, which would be 600-700 RPM. Pretty much for most of the same reasons we just discussed before. It's not great for the engine. And a lot of engines nowadays, they have DPFs and emissions packages. Idling puts a lot more carbon in them and causes them to plug faster. Now, if you are going to need to run it, it's better to run it at a higher RPM. At least Caterpillar recommends you're going to want to run it to about 1,000 to 1,200 RPM if you're doing extended idle time. Now, that does burn a little bit more fuel and it's louder, but if you're strictly speaking about the health of your diesel engine, it is best not to idle it for long periods of time. So the next one is super basic, and number 3 comes in at not checking your engine fluids regularly. Now, I don't mean you have to take a sample and send them off, although that is a good idea to periodically do that with your engine oil, coolant, transmission fluid, differential fluid. What I'm talking about is people that don't even check them at all. If you're one of those people, and I understand, especially trucks, it's hard sometimes. If you have the big cow catcher guard and you got to take that down and pull the hood open, and sometimes the hood's hard to open or close, it's a pain to check your fluids, but you always want to do it. And I mean, you're supposed to do it on your pre-inspection. Obviously, most people probably don't do that every day. Sure, some people do though, and it's good on them because not checking them can cause you lots of money and damage to the diesel engine. So if you're not checking your oil or your coolant, you may not know that maybe you're burning oil a lot more than you used to, and you're really low on oil. Or let's say you have coolant getting into the oil and it's been doing that for 2 weeks and you don't know it. You could be damaging the bearings. You could be potentially going to overheat that engine because you didn't check the oil or the coolant. There's a lot of things just by looking at the level and the condition you can do. Even as not a master mechanic, but if you pull your radiator cap and notice that the top is full of diesel fuel or engine oil, or there's no fluid in it, you know that's a problem. And if you catch it early enough, you could potentially save that engine. Not only that, same with oil. Oil tells you a lot about the condition of the engine. If there's really high level of oil, for instance, but your coolant level is fine, where would that be coming from? Well, you might be getting fuel in the oil, which will reduce the viscosity of the oil and potentially damage the engine and the bearings. And you may not have known it if you didn't check, although you can look for little cues such as decrease in oil pressure like that, or an increase in coolant temperature if you're running low on coolant. So it's a really good idea. I know you check the box that you did check it every day, but I don't know how many times we've brought in a truck for something unrelated. I checked the coolant or the oil, and guess what? It's really low, or there's something and there's not supposed to be. So it's a really good idea, even though it's very easy to do. A lot of people don't do it. Check your coolant and your oil regularly. It could save your engine in the end. Now the next one ties in with maintenance, and that is not doing your valve adjustments regularly, or at least when you're supposed to. Now your valve adjustments, what are they doing? Well, you're setting the gap generally, or a preload height on some items, between your jakes, between your intake and exhaust valves. Some have adjustable injectors, some have things called intake valve actuators. And what you're doing there is making sure that those gaps are set properly so that your valve train, your compression brake system, your emission system, the injectors are firing properly. Now, generally the thing that changes the most are the intake and exhaust valves, because a couple things are going on. Your valves are wearing into the valve seats, and also your valve train is wearing over time. So what you want to do is periodically check and inspect that interval, but you need to check and have them check. Now, if you're not doing it yourself, obviously you have a mechanic you trust do it, but having that check can tell you a lot about the condition of the valve train. If they're extremely tight, that might mean you have a valve that's wearing faster. You can also find stuff like possibly on a dual valve spring setup, maybe one of the springs is broken. Very rare, but I have seen that happen. I even have a video about that. But that, if left alone, would have destroyed the engine. Now, it's also bad for the intake and exhaust valves if they're out of spec, even if there's not really necessarily a problem, because the way the camshaft is designed to open and close the intake and exhaust valves, it puts a lot less stress on the valves themselves if they're properly adjusted. If they're way out of specification, you can actually be wearing the valves faster or potentially causing something like a drop valve sooner if they're not properly adjusted. So it is something you want to check with your manufacturer, see how often it should be done, and not something you want to miss. Now the next one is one I see all the time, and that is pinching off your wastegate hose. Depending on what style engine you have, some don't have a wastegate. If you have a VGT style turbocharger, which is very common on, let's say, an ISX 15, there's no wastegate to pinch off. But most engines that don't have a VGT turbo have a wastegated turbo. And what the wastegate is there to do is to basically reduce the amount of exhaust gases that go through the turbine in the exhaust side of the turbo, which if you reduce the amount of exhaust gases that pass through it, it reduces the RPM of the turbo, and you build a little bit less boost and decrease the RPM of the turbo. Now, if you don't know, the turbocharger will spin, especially under load, a lot faster than the engine will. Now, the engine RPM on most large diesel engines is 2,000 RPM. Maybe if you're a Power Stroke, it's 4,000, but these aren't F1 race engines, folks. The engine is not revving very quickly, but that turbocharger is, or it can be. They can go tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 RPM, depending on the model. And if you pinch that wastegate, the wastegate's there to protect predominantly the turbocharger. If you pinch it off, it's not able to protect itself from going too fast, making too much boost. So it's there for a reason, folks. The manufacturers didn't make the wastegate just to reduce your horsepower necessarily. And you're not generally increasing the boost by a ton, but what you are doing is taking the safety feature out of that turbocharger that's there for a reason, and it's there to help keep the engine, well, particularly the turbocharger, from destroying itself. This week's Destruction of the Week is from Jerry. We actually have 3 from Jerry this week, and this one is a turbo, just like we were talking about. As you can see, not sure if the wastegate was pinched off, but this turbo is pretty much shot. It completely cracked that compressor wheel right in half, fell out of there, not too good. Now the next one, we have a heartwarming story of a son being carried by his father. Yes, the wheel loader is moving the skid steer here, and that is because the skid steer was out on a job site. Apparently Jerry's very familiar with the skid steer, and none of the hydraulics are working, and this is what he found. So we have some damage here to the main hydraulic pump. You can see some chunks up there to the right, and yeah, it looks like the gear actually broke some of the teeth off, damaged the housing, and yeah, that's not an engine, but guess what? That is pretty destroyed. And the third one from Jerry, he sent this picture of the moon here. He had got a new telescope, and I wanted to show it to us. Actually, not a picture of the moon, although it kind of looks like it. What we got going on here is a Caterpillar engine, and the piston decided to kind of just disintegrate and melt. Apparently, the injector or nozzle was overfueling. Yeah, I would say just a little bit. Jerry sent great pictures. Thank you, Jerry. Anyone likes the Destruction of the Week? Say thank you to Jerry. He sends these pictures all the time. I want to say special thanks to him for all the help over the years for sending these pictures. And let's get back to the video. So there's only 2 topics left, folks, and number 6 comes in with running the wrong or no coolant thermostat. Now, Cat calls them temperature regulators, but no one knows what that means. So what we're talking about is the device in your cooling system that allows the hot coolant in the engine to go to the radiator. Now, there's a lot of misconceptions around there that you don't want your engine to run too hot or too cold, mostly too hot. And that is true. Overheating an engine will damage it very quickly. Let's say if you take it up to 250 degrees Fahrenheit, you're going to have a bad day with that engine, and that'll destroy it not secretly pretty quick and could result in blown head gasket, cracked head, various other horrible things. So a lot of people, they like to run them cooler. And let's say that engine's designed to run at 205 degrees, but you put a 160 degree thermostat in it, or run no thermostat at all, right? It's farther away from that overheat temperature. That's true. But what you're doing is you're slowly damaging that engine in a variety of ways that wouldn't cause as much catastrophic damage quickly like an overheat would. But what you could be doing is, with a lower coolant temperature, you're going to get less efficient combustion, which kind of ties in with all the problems we had with idling or running it, warming it up the wrong way also. So you can get an accumulation in the oil, and I'd be saying, well, you're talking about the cooling system. That's true. But the cooling system and the engine temperature ties in with the oil and the oil temperature. And if your oil temperature is too low, it's not going to be able to adequately burn off mostly moisture, but also some of the nasty byproducts you get from diesel combustion. Not only that, if you're running too cold, you're going to have more of those getting into the oil because your engine's not running as hot, which means it's running less efficiently. So you'll burn more fuel, cause more byproducts into the oil, and it will be causing your oil to degrade faster and just general engine wear to go faster. Cylinder walls, bearings, everything. So if you are having a problem where the engine's running too cool or you want it to stay that way, I would recommend sticking with the manufacturer recommended thermostats and keeping it closer to what it's supposed to be ran at. So our final topic, number 7, is one that really contentious subject, and that is installing dirty fuel filters or installing dry fuel filters. Now, I made a video specifically talking about oil pre-filling and fuel filter pre-filling a long time ago, and the video did very well. But what I want to talk about here is specifically the fuel system filters, because they operate in a different manner than the oil system. Now, the oil system, it has a bypass 100%. That means if the oil filter is full and it's plugged, let's say with dirty oil and contaminants, it will bypass the oil filter because the engine would rather have dirty oil than no oil. Not only that, let's say you just spun a new oil filter on it and the oil is very cold. It's 10 degrees outside. You start it up, it's going to bypass mostly the filter because the filter is not capable of flowing enough cold oil to get to the engine, and it's better to have dirty oil than no oil going to that engine. Fuel system operates generally much different. There's generally, sure there's engines out there that this is an exception to, but most fuel systems don't have a fuel filter bypass. If the fuel filter is plugged, you will not get enough fuel to the fuel system, and the engine will lug, slow down, or shut off. And the reason is the engine would rather have no fuel than dirty fuel getting to the high pressure pump. And the injectors are very expensive components, and running them with dirty fuel is going to damage them quickly. So what you want to do is install the fuel filters with clean fuel, or install them dry and then prime the system. Now, two ways to do that, folks. And running them dry is bad also. It's bad for the fuel system to have air getting to it. So if you install empty filters and then crank it forever, what you're doing is there's air pockets throughout the fuel system. It's trying to build pressure. It's bad for the high pressure pump and the injectors. So what you want to do is, if you are going to pre-fill fuel filters, what you want to do is fill them from the dirty side. And generally the dirty side on a fuel filter is not the center hole, which is the easy one to fill. It's usually the smaller outer holes on the dirty side. So what you'll need to do is get a small funnel or something to fill them that way. It's very tedious, but if you're going to pre-fill filters, that's the right way to do it. The other option is to prime the system after you install the filters. So the way you would do that would be you install the filter dry, although you want to lubricate the O-ring that's going onto it. And once it's installed, you then can pressure prime with either a high pressure tank with clean fuel, or you can vacuum prime depending on what engine you're working on. Some of them have a CompuCheck or a fitting that you could actually pull a vacuum and it'll pull fuel from the tank into the filters, which will cause them to go through the filter and have a clean fuel supply. Some engines, like a DD15, I believe they recommend that you pressure prime them with a tank. Some have hand priming pumps, which do work but are quite tedious, and it's hard to get air out of some systems, like a C15 generally. The cylinder head is the highest point in the fuel system, and you have to force fuel through it to get air out of the section of the filter housing, which is below the head. So the air is constantly rising to the top. So on some systems it's harder or easier to vacuum or pressure prime, but generally what you don't want to do is you don't want to just crank it and wait for it to start if you install dry filters, and what you don't want to do is pre-fill the filter with dirty fuel. So those are my 7 topics. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Some people may or may not be doing any of these. I know I've done some of these in the past in my own experience, so I thought it would be a good topic to discuss. If you guys made it to the end of the video, I want to thank you. Wish you a Happy New Year. Thanks for watching.